Chapter 1. A Boy from Argentina. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina. Most people today know him simply as Che Guevara, but in the beginning he was just Ernesto, a quiet boy who loved reading, sports, and adventure. His parents came from educated and respected families. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was an engineer with political ideas that leaned toward the left. His mother, Celia de la Serna, was intelligent, strong, and very modern for her time. She loved books, art, and conversation. She taught her children to think freely and to care about people who were less fortunate. From a young age, Ernesto suffered from asthma, a condition that made it difficult for him to breathe. He often had to stay home when other children played outside. But instead of becoming weak or lazy, Ernesto used that time to read. He read history, poetry, philosophy, and especially about great heroes and explorers. Books became his best friends. His family moved several times when he was a child, finally settling in the small city of Alta Gracia, in the hills of central Argentina. The air there was clean and dry, which helped his asthma. Ernesto spent his days riding his bicycle, swimming, and playing chess. He was brave and stubborn. Even when he had an asthma attack, he refused to give up. One of his favorite books was about Karl Marx, the German thinker who wrote about class struggle and equality. At that time, Ernesto didn't fully understand Marx's ideas, but they made him curious. He began to wonder why some people were rich and others poor, and why the world seemed unfair. His friends called him Fusa, a nickname from his last names, but later in life people would call him Che. In Argentina, Che is a friendly word, meaning hey or buddy. It became his identity later on. When Ernesto was in high school, he was known for his intelligence and his courage. He played rugby, a tough sport, even though his asthma made it difficult. His teachers admired his strong will and sharp mind. In 1947, Ernesto entered the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. He wanted to become a doctor, not for money, but to help others. He believed that a doctor could make a real difference in the lives of poor people. He was serious, focused, and always ready to learn. During his studies, he started traveling around Argentina during the holidays. He visited poor villages and saw how people lived without doctors, clean water, or good food. These trips made him question everything he knew about society. In one letter to a friend, he wrote, "I began to understand that the division of society is not only a local problem, but a global one." That thought stayed with him forever. Ernesto's childhood was also full of humor and imagination. He loved jokes, chess, and poetry. He often discussed politics and literature with his family at the dinner table. His mother once said that even as a child, Ernesto thought like a man twice his age. Still, he wasn't perfect. He was impatient, proud, and sometimes distant. But he had one quality that would define his life: a deep desire to change the world. By the time he graduated from medical school in 1953, Ernesto had become a strong, thoughtful young man. He was no longer just a student from Argentina. He was someone looking for meaning, for a purpose beyond himself. The political situation in Latin America was unstable. Many countries were ruled by dictators or corrupt governments supported by foreign powers. The poor became poorer and the rich stayed rich. This injustice made Ernesto restless. He wanted to see things with his own eyes. So, in 1952, while still a medical student, he decided to go on an extraordinary journey, a motorcycle trip across South America with his friend Alberto Granado. They wanted to explore the continent, meet its people, and understand its reality. This trip would change Ernesto's life forever. It would turn a young doctor into a revolutionary. As he packed his small bag, he took his medical tools, a few clothes, and a notebook. He had no idea that these simple items would become part of one of the most famous journeys in modern history. Standing next to Alberto and their old motorcycle, which they named La Poderosa, meaning the mighty one, Ernesto looked out at the road ahead. The wind was strong, and his asthma made him breathe heavily, but he smiled and said, "Let's go. The road is waiting for us." That road would take him deep into the heart of Latin America, into the poverty of the people, and into the dream that would guide him for the rest of his life. Key vocabulary: asthma, a medical condition that makes breathing difficult. Philosophy, the study of ideas about knowledge and life. Class struggle, conflict between rich and poor groups in society. Dictator, a leader who rules with total power, often unfairly. Revolutionary, someone who fights to change a system or government. In January 1952, Ernesto Guevara was 23 years old and almost finished with medical school. His close friend, Alberto Granado, was a 29-year-old biochemist. The two friends shared one dream: to see all of South America with their own eyes. They didn't want to read about it in books, they wanted to live it. Their plan was simple but ambitious: to travel from Argentina to Venezuela on Alberto's old motorcycle, a big and noisy machine they called La Poderosa II, the mighty one. It was far from perfect, often breaking down, but to them it represented freedom. Before leaving, Ernesto wrote in his diary, "The journey is not just for fun. It's a chance to discover the real Latin America, the land of the poor, the forgotten, and the hopeful." They started their trip from Córdoba, heading north through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and finally Venezuela. The trip would take almost a year, and it would change the way Ernesto saw the world. At first, the adventure was full of excitement. They rode through the open countryside, slept in cheap hostels or farms, and often ate whatever they could find. Sometimes, when they had no money, kind strangers shared food or a place to rest. They laughed, told jokes, and dreamed about the future. But as they continued north, the journey became harder. The motorcycle broke down many times, and finally it stopped working completely in Chile. From then on, they continued on foot, by hitchhiking, or by boat. The difficulties didn't stop them. They felt more alive than ever. In Chile, they saw the reality of poor workers in the copper mines. These men worked long hours underground, breathing dust and toxic air, earning almost nothing. Ernesto talked with them, listened to their stories, and saw their pain. He realized that their poverty was not because they were lazy or unlucky, but because the system was unfair. He wrote in his diary, "I saw the division between rich and poor more clearly than ever before. It is not an illusion, it is a deep wound across the continent." As they continued, they crossed the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on earth. The sun burned their skin, and they often went without food or water. But Ernesto never complained. His determination was stronger than his illness. In Peru, they visited the ancient city of Cusco, once the capital of the Inca Empire. There, Ernesto felt a deep connection with the indigenous people. He saw how the descendants of the Incas lived in poverty, ignored by the government, and treated as inferior. It made him angry and sad. He began to understand something. Latin America was not a group of separate countries, it was one land with one people suffering the same problems. He started to imagine a united Latin America, free from exploitation and injustice. One of the most important stops on their journey was the San Pablo leper colony on the banks of the Amazon River. It was a hospital for people with leprosy, a disease that caused terrible skin problems and often led to isolation from society. Ernesto and Alberto worked there for several weeks as medical volunteers. They treated patients, played football with them, and even shared meals, something few doctors would do at that time. Ernesto's kindness and respect for the patients touched everyone. On his 24th birthday, the lepers surprised him with a small party. That night, he swam across the river to show that there was no barrier between the sick and the healthy, only fear and prejudice. Later, he wrote, "I realized that the divisions between people are artificial. We are all part of the same human race." This experience deeply marked him. He was no longer only a medical student, he was becoming a social thinker and activist. By the time the journey ended in Caracas, Venezuela, both men were changed. Alberto decided to stay and work in a hospital, while Ernesto returned to Argentina to finish his studies. When Ernesto finally received his medical degree in 1953, he was not the same person who had left a year before. The poverty, hunger, and injustice he had seen across South America filled him with anger and determination. He now believed that medicine alone was not enough to change people's lives. To cure society's sickness, he thought something much bigger was needed, a revolution. He wrote in his diary, which would later become famous as the Motorcycle Diaries, "I am not me anymore, at least I'm not the same me. The walls around me are beginning to fall, and I see a new path, one of struggle and change." The journey that began as an adventure had turned into a mission. Ernesto Guevara was no longer just a doctor. He was now a man with a vision to fight for justice for all of Latin America. Key vocabulary: ambitious, showing a strong desire to succeed. Hitchhike, to travel by asking strangers for free rides. Exploitation, unfair treatment or use of others for profit. Leprosy, a serious disease that affects the skin and nerves. Prejudice, unfair feelings or opinions against certain people. Chapter 3. Awakening to Injustice. When Ernesto Guevara returned to Argentina after his long journey, he was no longer the same young man. The trip across South America had opened his eyes. He had seen poverty, hunger, and inequality everywhere he went. He had met miners who worked like slaves, farmers who had no land, and children who were sick and hungry. He now understood that medicine could not cure the deep problems of society. People were suffering not only because of disease, but because of injustice, the unfair distribution of wealth and power. After finishing his medical degree in 1953, Ernesto wanted to continue exploring the continent. He dreamed of finding a place where he could help create change. He believed that education and action together could transform people's lives. So he decided to travel again, this time north toward Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and finally Guatemala. Guatemala, the turning point. When Ernesto arrived in Guatemala City in late 1953, he found a country that was full of political energy. The president, Jacobo Arbenz, was trying to make big reforms. He wanted to give land to poor farmers and reduce the power of foreign companies, especially the giant American fruit company called United Fruit Company. To Ernesto, this was inspiring. He saw a government that was trying to build justice for its people. For the first time, he felt close to a real social revolution. He started meeting students, writers, and activists who supported Arbenz's reforms. He also began reading more deeply about Marxism, the political philosophy of Karl Marx, who believed that the only way to end inequality was for workers to control the economy and government. In his letters to his family, Che wrote passionately about his new ideas. This is not just about one country, it is about all of Latin America, one people suffering under the same chains. He spent his days reading, debating, and observing how the reforms were working. He also met a young Peruvian economist named Hilda Gardea, who would later become his first wife. Hilda was politically active and introduced him to other left-wing thinkers. She encouraged him to use the nickname that would soon become famous, Che. But Guatemala's experiment in reform didn't last long. The United States government saw Arbenz's socialist ideas as a threat. In 1954, the CIA helped organize a military coup, a violent takeover of the government. Planes bombed the capital, soldiers rebelled, and the reform government collapsed. Arbenz was forced to resign and flee the country. Che Guevara watched all of this happen. He saw foreign powers destroy a government that only wanted to help its people. This event deeply changed him. He later said, "It was there, in Guatemala, that I became what I am." From that moment, Che decided that peaceful reform was not enough. He believed that only armed struggle could defeat imperialism and injustice. A refuge in Mexico. After the fall of Arbenz, Guatemala became dangerous for anyone connected to his government. Che was forced to leave. He crossed the border into Mexico, where many political refugees had gone to escape persecution. In Mexico City, Che tried to rebuild his life. He worked as a doctor and photographer to earn money. He lived simply, always reading and studying politics. He married Hilda Gardea, and they had a daughter named Hilda Beatrice.
But something inside him was restless. He felt that he was meant to do more than live a quiet life. One night, in 1955, a friend introduced him to a group of Cuban exiles. They were planning to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista, who ruled Cuba with American support. The leader of this group was a young lawyer with sharp eyes and great charisma, Fidel Castro. Che and Fidel met in a small apartment in Mexico City. They talked for hours about history, politics, and the future of Latin America. Che was impressed by Fidel's determination and clear plan. Fidel, in turn, admired Che's experience in Guatemala. By the end of the night, they had formed a deep respect for each other. Fidel told Che about his plan. He and his group would sail to Cuba on a small boat called the Ranma, land secretly, and start a guerrilla war in the mountains. Che didn't hesitate. He said, "I'm coming with you." That decision would change his life forever. Preparing for revolution. During the next months, Che trained with the Cuban revolutionaries. He learned how to use weapons, survive in the jungle, and lead men. Despite his asthma, he became one of the most dedicated fighters in the group. He also continued acting as a doctor, teaching first aid and caring for his comrades. His mixture of medical skill and courage quickly earned him respect. In his diary, Che wrote, "I have finally found my place. The path of the doctor and the path of the revolutionary are now one." He was no longer just Ernesto Guevara, the doctor from Argentina. He had become Che Guevara, the revolutionary. Key vocabulary: injustice, unfair treatment or situation. Coup, a sudden, illegal takeover of a government. Imperialism, control by one country over another, usually for profit or power. Guerrilla, a member of a small group fighting against a large army. Refugee, a person who leaves their country because of danger or persecution.
Chapter 4. Meeting Fidel Castro. In 1955, Mexico City was full of political exiles, dreamers, and revolutionaries. It was there that Ernesto Che Guevara met the man who would change the course of his life, Fidel Castro. Fidel was a tall, confident Cuban lawyer who spoke with passion about freeing his country from the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Batista had taken power through a military coup and ruled Cuba with violence and corruption. The rich lived in luxury, while many poor Cubans had no land, no education, and no hope. When Che first met Fidel, it was at the home of a mutual friend. The two men talked for hours, discussing history, injustice, and the future of Latin America. Fidel described his plan to sail from Mexico to Cuba with a small group of men, land secretly, and start a guerrilla war in the mountains. Che listened carefully. The idea was risky, almost impossible. But he felt inspired by Fidel's determination. By the end of the meeting, Che told him directly, "Count me in. I will go with you." That night, their friendship began, one built on shared ideals and courage. Training for revolution. The next months were filled with preparation. Fidel's group called themselves the 26th of July movement, named after the failed 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks in Cuba, which Fidel had led years earlier. Now they were ready to try again. Che joined the group as both a doctor and a fighter. They trained in secret outside Mexico City, learning to handle weapons, march in formation, and survive in the wilderness. Despite his asthma, Che was one of the toughest. When others complained, he stayed calm. When food was scarce, he shared what little he had. He also treated injuries and taught his comrades first aid. The men respected him not only as a doctor, but also as someone with discipline and moral strength. Che's wife, Hilda Gadea, was worried about the danger he was facing. They had a baby daughter, and she wanted him to stay safe. But Che told her, "I cannot live without fighting for what I believe in." In November 1956, after months of preparation, the plan was ready. 82 men gathered to board a small, old yacht named Granma. Their goal, sail from Mexico to Cuba, land secretly, and begin the revolution. The voyage on the Granma. The journey was a disaster from the start. The boat was overloaded and moved slowly through rough seas. Many of the men got seasick, including Che, who suffered terribly from his asthma. They were supposed to arrive in Cuba after 5 days, but it took 7. By the time they reached the coast, they were exhausted and hungry. On December 2nd, 1956, the Granma landed in a swampy area of eastern Cuba called Los Coloradas. The men waded through water and mud, trying to reach dry land. But within hours, Batista's soldiers discovered them. A violent battle followed. Most of the group was killed or captured. Only about 20 men survived and escaped into the nearby Sierra Maestra Mountains. Among them were Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and Che Guevara. Life in the Sierra Maestra. The survivors were tired, hungry, and surrounded by enemy forces. But in the mountains, they found safety and time to rebuild. Che quickly became one of the most important figures in the group. He was brave in battle, calm under pressure, and deeply committed to their cause. At first, he worked as a doctor, treating wounded soldiers and sick peasants in the villages. But soon, Fidel noticed his leadership skills. Che began leading small military units in ambushes and attacks against Batista's army. The local farmers, called campesinos, at first feared the rebels, but when they saw how Che treated them with respect, sharing food, giving medicine, and listening to their problems, they began to help the revolutionaries. They brought food, information, and even joined the fight. Che believed that a revolution must come from the people themselves. He often said, "The true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love for humanity, for justice, and for truth." Che the warrior. As the months passed, Che proved himself not only as a doctor, but as a skilled commander. His discipline and courage inspired others. He organized his men carefully, taught them to read and write, and punished any act of robbery or cruelty. Even though the army was much larger, Batista's soldiers feared Che and his fighters. Using guerrilla warfare, they attacked quickly, disappeared into the jungle, and struck again later. The mountains became a symbol of resistance. Slowly, news of the rebellion spread across Cuba. Fidel and Che became national heroes among the poor. Many young men and women left their homes to join them. The revolution was growing. Between battles. At night, around the campfire, Che often read books to the soldiers. He carried philosophy and poetry in his backpack even in the middle of war. His favorite authors were Marx, Lenin, and Neruda. He also wrote in his diary every day, describing their struggles, victories, and hopes. These diaries would later become one of the most famous records of the Cuban Revolution. Che's health sometimes failed him. His asthma attacks were painful and medicine was hard to find, but he never complained. Once, when Fidel suggested he rest, Che replied, "Rest is for the next world, not for this one." His toughness made him a legend among the rebels.
By 1958, after 2 long years of fighting, the revolutionaries were no longer a small group, they were an army. Now, Che commanded hundreds of men, leading them into key battles across Cuba. The fight for liberation was reaching its final stage. Key vocabulary: dictatorship, a government ruled by one person with total power; guerrilla war, fighting by small, mobile groups using surprise attacks; courage, the ability to face danger without fear; rebellion, an organized fight against authority; and ambush, a surprise attack from a hidden position.
Chapter 5. The Revolution Triumphs. The Cuban Revolution had begun. The small group of rebels, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, were hiding in the mountains of Sierra Maestra. The year was 1957, and they were fighting against the army of the dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first, the rebels were weak. They had few guns, little food, and no medical supplies. But they had something powerful: hope. They believed that justice and freedom were worth any sacrifice. Che became one of the most respected leaders. He was not Cuban, but the fighters trusted him completely. He treated everyone equally: soldiers, peasants, and even captured enemies. He often said, "The true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love." Doctor and warrior. Even in the jungle, Che continued to use his medical skills. He created small hospitals in huts made of wood and leaves. He treated wounds, infections, and tropical diseases. But Che was more than a doctor. He was also a commander. Fidel gave him his own column, a group of fighters to lead. Che trained them to move silently, to attack quickly, and to respect civilians. He also taught them discipline. If someone stole from a villager or treated people badly, Che punished them strictly. He wanted the revolution to be moral, not just political. His soldiers admired his courage. Che always fought at the front, carrying his rifle and his medical bag together. In his diary, he wrote, "Every day I feel closer to the people. Their suffering has become my own." The people's support. The peasants living in the mountains were poor and tired of Batista's soldiers, who often burned their homes and stole their food. When they met Che's group, they were afraid at first, but soon they saw the difference. Che's men paid for the food they took. They helped the farmers with their crops. They built schools and taught children to read. Slowly, the people began to trust them. Some young farmers even joined the rebels. The revolution was growing stronger. The rebels spread their message through a secret radio station called Radio Rebel, Rebel Radio. Che helped write the broadcasts. They told the truth about what was happening and gave the Cuban people hope. Battles in the mountains. By 1958, the Cuban army began a huge attack on the rebels. They sent thousands of soldiers to destroy them, but the rebels knew the mountains well. They used guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, and ambushes. Che showed great skill as a strategist. He planned operations carefully and used small victories to inspire others. In one famous battle, his men captured a train full of weapons in the city of Santa Clara. This victory cut Batista's army in half. The people of Santa Clara welcomed the rebels with joy. They brought food, medicine, and information. It was clear that the revolution had already won in the hearts of the Cuban people. On January 1, 1959, Batista realized he had lost.
He fled Cuba in the middle of the night, taking his money and his closest allies with him. When Fidel's army entered Havana, the capital, they were greeted by thousands of cheering people waving Cuban flags. The revolution had triumphed. Che entered Havana a few days later, exhausted but proud. After 2 years of living in the jungle, the impossible had become real. A new Cuba. After the victory, Che and Fidel began to rebuild the country. Batista's corrupt government was gone, but the island was poor and divided. Many people could not read, and most of the land belonged to a few rich families. Che believed that the revolution must not stop with victory, it had to transform society. He became the head of the National Bank, and later the Minister of Industry. He helped create schools, hospitals, and factories. He also promoted literacy campaigns, programs to teach every Cuban adult to read and write. He believed that knowledge was the first step to freedom. In speeches, he said, "A revolution is not just about changing leaders, it is about changing minds." Simplicity and example. Che lived modestly, even as a government official. He wore simple clothes, rode a bicycle to work, and refused special privileges. He wanted to set an example of honesty and discipline. But not everyone agreed with him. Some of his economic ideas, like eliminating money bonuses or replacing them with moral rewards, were criticized as unrealistic. Others admired his idealism and courage. For Che, the most important thing was commitment to justice, not comfort. An internationalist dream. Even while helping Cuba rebuild, Che continued to think about the rest of the world. He believed that the struggle against oppression should not stop in one country. He started traveling abroad, representing Cuba in Africa, Asia, and the Soviet Union. He spoke at international conferences, calling for unity among poor nations. In his speeches, he declared, "The struggle is won. Wherever there is injustice, we must be there." This idea would lead him to leave Cuba a few years later, searching for new revolutions in other parts of the world. Key vocabulary. Dictator. A ruler who has total power, often gained by force. Guerrilla tactics. Surprise attacks by small groups of fighters. Triumph. A great victory or success. Literacy. The ability to read and write. Idealism. The belief in noble goals even if they seem difficult to reach.
Chapter 6. Che Guevara in the New World, Africa and Beyond. After the revolution in Cuba, Che Guevara became famous all over the world. To many people, he was a hero, a symbol of freedom and resistance. His face appeared in newspapers, magazines, and posters. But fame was not what Che wanted. He never cared about luxury, money, or popularity. What he wanted was global justice. He believed that the Cuban Revolution was only the beginning. Che often said, "If you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are my comrade." For him, the fight against poverty and oppression had to continue, not just in Cuba, but everywhere. A global mission. In 1964, Che began traveling to many countries as a representative of Cuba. He visited China, the Soviet Union, Egypt, and Algeria, meeting world leaders and learning about different revolutions. At the United Nations in New York, he gave a powerful speech.
He spoke against the United States' interference in Latin America and Africa. He defended poor nations and called for global equality. His speech shocked many diplomats, but inspired millions of ordinary people. They saw him as a voice for the voiceless, a man who dared to tell the truth in front of the powerful. Che became known not only as a revolutionary, but also as an internationalist, someone who believes that all people are connected in the same struggle for justice. A new battlefield, Africa. By 1965, Che had grown restless again. He felt that his work in Cuba was done. The country had achieved great progress in health and education, but in his heart, he wanted to keep fighting. He believed that Africa could be the next great revolutionary continent. Many countries there were fighting to free themselves from European colonial powers. Che secretly left Cuba and traveled to Congo, a country in Central Africa that had recently gained independence but was now in chaos. His mission was to help local rebels resist the government supported by Western countries. He used a false name, Ramon Benitez, and wore a disguise to avoid being recognized. In the jungles of Congo, Che tried to train rebel fighters. He taught them about discipline, unity, and strategy. But he soon realized that the situation was much more difficult than in Cuba. The local forces were divided, poorly organized, and lacked motivation. Many soldiers deserted. Supplies were missing, and disease spread quickly. In his diary, Che wrote sadly, "This is not the same as Cuba. The men are brave, but there is no spirit of sacrifice." After several months of struggle, Che understood that the mission was hopeless. He was sick, tired, and disappointed. In late 1965, he returned secretly to Cuba. But instead of resting, he began to plan his next mission. The Call of Latin America. Che's dream had always been to free Latin America from poverty and foreign control. He believed that if one country could rise again, just like Cuba, others would follow. He chose Bolivia as his next destination. Bolivia was one of the poorest countries in South America, with deep social inequality and a weak government. He thought it was the perfect place to start a new revolution that could spread across the continent. In 1966, he secretly entered Bolivia using a false passport. He built a small guerrilla camp in the jungle region of Nyancawazu. His group included Cubans, Bolivians, and fighters from other countries. Once again, Che lived in the wilderness, cutting trees, building huts, and teaching his men how to fight. He wrote in his notebook, "We begin again, from nothing. But this time, the dream is larger, the liberation of all Latin America." Difficulties in the jungle. Life in the Bolivian jungle was very hard. The group faced hunger, rain, mosquitoes, and disease. Many locals were afraid to help them. The Bolivian government, supported by the United States, soon discovered their presence. The CIA sent military advisors to assist the Bolivian army. They trained special units to track down Che's guerrillas. Che's group became isolated. Communication with Cuba was lost, and reinforcements never arrived. One by one, his men were captured or killed. Despite all this, Che never gave up. He kept a small diary where he described each day the rain, the hunger, and the fear. His words showed both strength and humanity. "It is better to die standing than to live kneeling," he wrote. the final battle. In October 1967, the Bolivian army surrounded Che's remaining group near the small village of La Higuera. They were outnumbered and out of ammunition. Che was wounded in the leg during a fight and captured alive. He was taken to a small school building where he was held for 1 day. Even as a prisoner, he stayed calm. Witnesses said he looked his captors in the eyes and said, "Do not be afraid. You are only going to kill a man." On October 9th, 1967, Che Guevara was executed. He was 39 years old. His body was secretly buried, and for many years no one knew where. But his image, the famous photo of his face with the beret and star, became one of the most powerful symbols in modern history. Key vocabulary: interference, unwanted involvement by another country. Internationalist, someone who believes all nations should work together. Colonial powers, countries that controlled other regions, usually in Africa or Asia. Reinforcements, extra people or supplies sent to support a group. Execute, to kill someone officially, often after capture.
Chapter 7. Legacy of Che Guevara, the man, the myth, the symbol. The news of Che Guevara's death spread around the world in October 1967. For some, he was a dangerous rebel who had tried to bring communism to new countries. For others, he was a hero, a man who fought for justice and freedom until his last breath. Even his enemies respected his courage. A U.S. officer who studied his campaigns once said, "He was brave, disciplined, and absolutely loyal to his cause." But Che's death was not the end of his story. In many ways, it was the beginning of his legend. The birth of a symbol. Soon after his death, a photograph taken by the Cuban photographer Alberto Corda became famous. It showed Che with long hair, a black beret, and a calm but intense expression. His eyes looked upward, full of determination. This picture became one of the most recognizable images in history. It appeared on posters, t-shirts, walls, and books all over the world. It represented not only the man himself, but the spirit of rebellion, the desire to change an unjust world. To many young people in the 1960s and 1970s, Che was a symbol of hope and resistance. Students, workers, and activists used his image to express their dreams of a fairer society. The ideas that lived on. Che Guevara was not just a fighter. He was also a thinker and writer. He left behind many letters, speeches, and diaries. These writings showed that he believed in discipline, education, and moral strength. In one speech, he said, "The true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love." He wanted people to fight not out of hate, but out of compassion, because they loved humanity and could not accept injustice. Even today, his ideas about solidarity, equality, and moral responsibility continue to inspire political movements around the world. After Che's death, revolutions continued in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Many of those who fought in these movements said they were inspired by his story. In Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Chile, young revolutionaries studied Che's writings on guerrilla warfare. In South Africa, anti-apartheid fighters admired his belief in international unity. And in Europe and America, students protested against injustice under his famous image. Che became a universal icon, not just for communists, but for anyone who opposed oppression.
However, his legacy also created controversy. Some people argued that his methods, especially the use of armed struggle, caused unnecessary violence. Others said he was too idealistic and that his economic policies in Cuba had failed. Still, even critics agreed that Che lived according to his principles. He never asked others to do what he would not do himself. He gave up comfort, power, and even his life for what he believed in. Rediscovering Che. In 1997, 30 years after his death, Che Guevara's remains were found in Bolivia. His body was returned to Cuba, where he was buried with honor in the city of Santa Clara, the place of his greatest victory. Thousands of people came to the ceremony. Old fighters cried, young students raised flags. Fidel Castro gave a speech saying, "Che was not only an extraordinary man of action, but also a man of deep thought and unbreakable principles." Today, visitors to Cuba can see Che's mausoleum, a large monument built in his memory. Inside there are photos, letters, and his personal belongings, his beret, his backpack, and his notebooks. People from all over the world come to pay their respects. The meaning of Che today. More than half a century after his death, Che Guevara's image is still everywhere. It appears in art, music, and fashion. But for many, it is not about politics anymore. It is about standing up for what you believe in. To some, he represents rebellion against injustice. To others, he is a reminder that one person can make a difference. Teachers, writers, and filmmakers continue to tell his story. His face, printed in black and red, reminds new generations of courage and sacrifice. But it is important to remember that behind the myth, there was a real human being, someone who laughed, suffered, loved, and made mistakes. Che himself once said, "Let the world change you, and you can change the world." That message, simple but powerful, still speaks to millions today. Final thoughts. Che Guevara's life was full of contradictions. He was a doctor who took up arms, a soldier who dreamed of peace, and a revolutionary who fought for love. He lived only 39 years, but his ideas crossed borders and generations. For English learners, his story is not just about history. It is about passion, courage, and the power of belief. Whether you agree with his politics or not, Che Guevara's life teaches one important lesson. If you believe in something deeply, you must be ready to act for it. Key vocabulary: legacy, what someone leaves behind after death. Ideas, influence. Compassion, deep sympathy and care for others. Controversy, public disagreement or debate. Mausoleum, a large building where someone is buried. Principles, strong moral beliefs or values.